Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to a conversation about regulatory failure. But before we have a conversation about anything, GREG, of course, is hosted by the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment here in New Zealand, MB, and therefore it's very appropriate that I start with MB's opening karakia, and I do so now. Tawhia tō mana kia mau kia maya, ka huri, takuaro, ki te pai ka hurangi, kei reira te oranga moku, ma mahi tahi ka ora ka puawai. A mātou mahi katoa ka pono ka tika tihe mauri ora. Now we're together, members of the audience. It's very nice to see you, and I see that there are a number of you. I see a number of you coming in, and as you come in, you'll recall, of course, that these webinars are very much in the public domain. They're very much live if you're coming in now or joining us or just joined us, but they'll also be recorded. So you could be watching them in a couple of weeks' time. You could be watching them, and you probably are watching them primarily in New Zealand, but also through sister communities of practice in the business of government and regulation right around the world, not least Australia, through ANSOG, or the Institute of Regulators in the UK. It's always very much the case of these conversations that wherever and whenever you are, you're very welcome here. I should also say that it's very much your conversation. You participate using the Q&A function. You can talk to each other through the chat function. We encourage it. It's not rude. It's part of a vibrant conversation on this very, very important topic. We do record the webinar itself. We don't record your Q&A and we don't record your chats. So you are at liberty in that regard. Now, you'll remember a number of you in pre-COVID time, some of the locations like Australia and the UK, and you used to go to places, and some people are still doing it mercifully a bit more to get to these places. They're called airports. And what would happen is we go into a bookshop in the airport and you'd see these titles in the airport newsagent or bookshop like, you know, how to make a success of yourself, how to make a success of things. What does success look like? You very rarely see titles like what does failure look like or how to make a failure of things. And you'd be even less likely to see titles like what does regulatory failure look like? But it's very much part of the case of this conversation, members of the audience, that it's a critical question to ask ourselves, practically speaking, and we do so. Of course, last episode, we spent the whole episode having a really good, and certainly that's what the feedback suggests, conversation about regulatory language. And one of the motifs of that conversation was a regulatory glossary or dictionary. But one of the phrases which is particularly difficult to talk about, and you could, and we will, spend this whole conversation looking at that, is regulatory failure. Why is it important to describe and define? What does it mean? After all, we're the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative. Is it really practical to worry about why we call something a regulatory failure or what constitutes it? More on these questions now, and also how to deal with regulatory failure effectively, or at least how to begin to contemplate dealing with it. We've got a glossary of guests again who are extremely well qualified to help us look at it. First of all, Professor Jeroen van der Heijden, who's a chair in regulatory practice at Victoria University of Wellington. He's known to us. You saw him last year at the conference, and you will have seen him around generally on GREG related things. I'm going to do a quick plug for the Essence of Regulation on YouTube, which are his films and also his blog. The blogs have really been the genesis of a state-of-the-art paper discussing 38, count them, 38 articles, which Jeroen has valiantly read and reviewed all around the world about what is it that constitutes regulatory failure, and can we agree on a definition? How did Jeroen do in his quest? Result, you'll find out very shortly, but not before we introduce Deb Despard, who is also known to us in the GREG community, the Deputy Director of Compliance Systems Delivery at Maritime New Zealand, but also a wealth of previous experience in health and safety, workplace health and safety, rail, the gambling sector, right across the systems. And Deb spoke last year about the public private nexus, equally known to us in the GREG community, and a supporter of the conferences and many other occasions over the years is George Mason, who joins us as the Director of Regulatory Environment at MB. And he's got long-standing previous experience across workplace health and safety and employment regulatory systems, much more. A very warm welcome to you, colleagues. It's lovely to have you here. It's lovely to have you, members of the audience. Let's get straight to it. Now, George, I'm going to kick off with you, if I may, but I'll clear my throat first. Welcome. Last episode, we talked about the importance of clear definition in regulatory language. Why do you think, if you do think this, it's important to get the definition of what we call a regulatory failure right?
Well, I think we're dealing with a very complex set of interactions. When we think of regulation, we can define it in various ways, sort of very broadly from all the activities of government, sort of right to the very sharp end of enforcement. And I guess the point about a regulatory failure definition is maybe trying to land on something which is going to be meaningful and can help us practically with where we focus our attention for obviously preventing these kinds of circumstances arising. So I think it is important for us to get the language right and to have that conversation about what we mean by regulatory failure, and particularly the scope of it, because potentially it's incredibly broad. But it may be that it's more useful for us to try to limit the field of play, as it were, in ways that can make it more helpful for us. I'm kind of reminded of Chicken Licken a little bit. You know, the sky is falling, regulatory failure, and we can run around awfully excited by the sound of the term, but actually what we have to do, I think, is challenge ourselves to find ways to narrow the field of play so that we can actually take some meaningful action to help prevent these circumstances arising. So I think that the language is important for that primary reason.
Thank you, George, and that's a terrific introduction. And I guess it tells us with Chicken Licken what sort of regulatory animal we perhaps ultimately are. From your perspective, Deb, what's the importance, having regard to things that have gone on in our world, of framing a definition?
Thanks, Ian. And I agree with George. I think if we can define regulatory failure and what it means to us, we've got a better chance of mitigating any risk of it. I think it's interesting that regulatory failure terminology is most commonly, and understandably, I suppose, used when a catastrophe, an event happens. But actually, if you really examine the regulatory failure, most likely there were precursors or system failings long before that actually happened. And I think in the case of Waka Kotahi, for example, there were many regulatory practice precursors which could have been deemed failures well before the Dargaville diesel incident, where a man lost his life as a result of a faulty seatbelt, and then by a third-party provider. So I think, to sum up, having a clear understanding, making sure that your regulatory workforce is equipped to lift up rocks and understand what's going on and take care of the regulatory system, and be vigilant in order to avoid said failure.
Thank you, Deb, and that's a very poignant framing, and I think it's one of the things that we'll come on to. Regulatory failures, whatever you call them, don't necessarily happen at 5 o'clock when terrible things often happen. They're in play at 4:59, and they might even be in play metaphorically and possibly literally at 3:30. It's the undercurrent point. We're going to touch on that. Jeroen, welcome to you. Let's talk about, not all of them, but the 38 articles I think you reviewed. You published your findings of a really interesting state-of-the-art paper back in February, and you've had engagement on the blogs that have led up to that. Two things. Why was the question important to you? And I guess we're all itching to know, how did the result turn out?
Thanks, Ian. Cheers. Look, I didn't really start out my quest as a search for a one-size-fits-all definition for the term regulatory failure. I really wanted to know, what is it that we know about regulatory failure? So what happens if you review a large number of reported regulatory failures that have been studied for academics or independent committees. And what I very quickly came to realize is that indeed there is no one single definition for the term regulatory failure. Everybody seems to define this differently. And that strikes me as sort of interesting because indeed, as George and Deb and you already highlighted, we very often see a regulatory failure reported in the news. And then it is very often that we see people saying, I know a regulatory failure when I see it. And that actually triggered for me the question, so what is a regulatory failure? So I couldn't really get a single definition, and that's what we will be talking about throughout the webinar. But what I did realize is that if you look at the broader literature, it really depends on how people look at regulation, what they consider to be a failure. So the broader regulatory literature has a few perspectives that explain why regulation is in place. So for instance, to serve the public good, public interest, or governments just do what they're doing best, institutional perspective, or maybe governments are captured by private interest and therefore they regulate. Private interest theory of regulation might explain regulatory failure. And the last one that I touched on is known as the public choice theory, which really argues that, well, sometimes regulators and governments might actually introduce regulation to serve their own goals. And again, sort of really depending on why you think regulation is in place, explains what you might see and experience as a regulatory failure.
That's interesting. Thank you, Jeroen. And I guess what I'm picking from this is it tells you, perhaps it's a negative way of looking at it, but regulatory failure tells you what regulatory success is, hence the airport paperbacks that I was cheeky about, but it also tells you what sort of regulator we are. So I guess there's a practical in that. Now, members of the audience is really open to you, and I'm encouraging you, and one of your number has already done it, one of you over 200. Thank you very much. Is coming through with a Q&A and comments. And Hamish, I'm going to pick yours straight away. I should add, keep them rolling. We'll pick them up. And there's Grant. Thank you very much, Grant. And you can also vote on them. So you can watch them whiz about the screen. And that happens. But while we're static for the moment on those, what's the panel's view of regulatory failure when, this is interesting, circumstances overtake the model regulations the model that regulations were intended to address? So I guess it means that the regs are just not fit for purpose, or they're not future-proofed. And the question goes on at length to say, should regulations be designed with potential futures in mind? Thinking about remote delivery of alcohol, legislation designed when it only applied to things like wine from wineries, but it's now remote and immediate everywhere. I'd throw one in about a few years ago now, gambling, internet gambling, and in the US, you know, the old Fedwire statutes, and how do you shoehorn that? So I guess it's a problem of contemporaneity and dynamic reading in. Is it a failure if the regs were actually not designed on the face of it to aim for that? Or what's the view? George, I'll start with you on that.
Well, I mean, it goes further than regulation becoming outmoded by changing context. Sometimes we just get the regulation wrong. Look, I guess we all come at this from our own perspectives, and that's, I think, the point that Jeroen's making. So we, I guess, have our own prejudices in this space. I probably come at it from the perspective of the practitioner,
Yes.
very much. And I suppose, you know, there's an element to which, as a practitioner, when you're actually, you know, donkey deep in regulation, not everything works all the time. There's failures going on in your system daily. It's not that's part of the stock and trade of being a regulator. Not everything you try is going to succeed, and not all the performance objectives you might want to reach you're going to be able to reach, particularly when you think about the complex nature of what regulation is, where you're engaging with environments that you don't have complete control over, that have their own rules and norms, and you're in there essentially trying to influence the behaviour of actors that you have no direct control over. So you're just not going to be successful all the time. I think that's one thing I would say about regulatory failure, and that contextual piece in, whether that's a changing context or whether that's the environment you're presented with. Don't think you're going to be successful all the time. I think the other point, the other headline point, which for me is helpful. I think often about, well, what is it that the regulations were put in place for originally? Normally I think of regulation as involving activity which society thinks is inherently beneficial, but has downside risks or potential harms. If it's not that, then it's probably crime, and we're dealing with it as a criminal offence. I sort of do distinguish between crimes and regulation in my kind of mental framing, because I think you have to say that the activity that we're engaged with is inherently beneficial, but does have some downside effects. And so we with legislation, what we do is we construct a bunch of obligations associated with the undertaking of that activity. We confer some state power in relation to making sure those obligations are followed, and then we also apply state resources to go out and apply those powers. And I would argue hold duty holders who engage in this activity to account for the standards that the legislation implements. So I guess at one level, this idea of accountability being a central aspect of the regulator's activities, for me, is quite core. And so I guess coming back to your original question about, well, when context changes, what does that mean for the regulator? I guess that means, sometimes the regulator's not able to hold it to account. Sometimes holding to account, doesn't seem so sensible in terms of the broader supporting authorising environment. I can think of a particular example where I was involved in a regulator space with the shop trading hours restrictions. So, this is quite a controversial issue.
Absolutely.
They had a particular social context, which it seems as time has gone on has changed, and there's less public support for the regulator actually being highly proactive in terms of shop trading hours. You end up with a game of, well, should in that context we focus resource around migrant exploitation, or should we deal with shop trading as regulation? And interestingly, those are the kinds of trade-offs you make as a regulator.
We'll hold that there, George. Thank you for that. There's accountability, there's trade-off, there's shops. You won't be buying the paperbacks that we mentioned earlier about what's a regulatory failure. But I think what we're saying is maybe you should be, because it's becoming a practical issue in that paperback form. Deb, to you, the point that George makes about the trade-off, and, it's common ground. We're in public, but I don't think it's a state secret to say that the government and its agencies do not have infinite resources. There are resource-based allocation decisions that have to be taken by mature people day in, day out. That goes to this, doesn't it, Deb? What do you say to that?
It really does. And to the question, it seldom is the legislative framework within which we're working ideal, and sometimes it absolutely does get in our way. And without wanting to give the impression that I don't care for core activities, because they are absolutely essential, there are different ways to achieve your result. And some of the best things that I've seen in the practitioner's field is that steps outside, not outside of mandate, but in an innovative way to try and achieve the result, working with the sector, joining, creating bodies and engagement with partner agencies and the sector, and getting the kind of results that you're looking for. But you're right, Ian, we won't ever be as resourced as we need to be. Often it takes a regulatory failure for us to receive the resources that we might have needed before the regulatory failure happened. And I think there's another example with Waka Kotahi, a good investment and an acknowledgement that the regulatory function was absolutely vital to the safety of the road transport area. So we're always having to make those trade-offs. And I love George's example, which is so stark and obvious to me that of course we wouldn't do that over that, but actually often in the detail of our work, it's difficult to step back and take a look at that and I think even our workforce is comfortable with not doing some things. That's actually been one of the most challenging aspects of bringing about change and innovation in the way that we do our work, just saying to people, let's not do that thing.
And I'll jump in there, Deb. Thank you for that, because it actually picks up very nicely on Jacqueline's question. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. And it's a comment as well, really, that there's often an element of regulatory capture and regulatory failure. Jeroen, that's one in your taxonomy. We'll come to you on that if we may in a sec. We trust that a sector, export educational buildings, for example, will run itself safely and robustly, ignoring the temptation to make profits, as we can all see the question there. But we do need sector involvement. So you've got this element of trust model, but we are the regulator, aren't we, on the other hand? How do we manage this as regulators? I'm going to ask all of you that, because it's a balance and a question. Jeroen, you found 4 ways of describing regulatory failure in the 38 pieces. Public interest theory, we'll touch on them in a bit. Public choice theory, you've mentioned. Private interest theory, which you've described, and the sort of the capture issues that can flow from all of those, and institutional theories. It's this tension we need to hold hands and work together where appropriate. Deb did the public-private sector collaboration webinar on the GREG conference last year, which you were involved in. How does all that fit in terms of the choices that regulators make and the definitions that you've looked at in the literature?
Fantastic question, Ian. Thanks for that. Look, I think one of the most one of the key take-home lessons perhaps of that review is that we should acknowledge that not only does regulation mean different things to different people, and not only do different people see different needs for regulation, also regulatory failure means very different things to different people. So if you go through the literature, or if you would sort of explore, the need for regulation, if you would ask regulators, why do we regulate? Probably most of them would say, oh, we regulate for the public good. We regulate to prevent problems. We regulate to achieve big positive societal outcomes. And then we as a regulator then tend to see a regulatory failure if our piece of regulation or our regulatory instrument that was meant to achieve that positive outcome is not achieving it. But if the public at large, or subgroups in the public, are much more critical and say, oh, but regulator, you were captured by a private industry, and your regulation might work really well for them, but not for us, the public at large, that is a regulatory failure in itself. So you might talk about different things as regulator and the people that you serve. I think that is one of the most important things to keep in the back of our minds. There is no single definition. We as regulators specifically shouldn't think that we hold the right definition, or maybe even need a perfect definition. And another thing is that we need to understand that regulatory failure very often is an issue of an objective observation and then the rhetorical interpretation of what has happened. Very often the rhetorical part gets out of hand when the media reports on that issue that we see as the regulatory failure. So those two things are really important to keep in the back of our minds when we are talking about regulatory failure.
Absolutely. No, thank you. George, how does all that sit with you?
Well, I think that Jeroen's point about the media's interesting with this idea of regulatory failure. As I said, sort of regulatory failure comes at various levels. At one level, regulators are failing every day. But I think one of the things we sometimes do get captured by is the sort of the regulatory failure writ large, which I guess is maybe that's where we go to when we think of regulatory failure. I see those kinds of regulatory failures as more of a political declaration of regulatory failure, and those are circumstances, I guess, where the political environment makes a declaration or reaches a place that the regulator has lost legitimacy. And those are, I suppose, for many, that is sort of the big kahuna of regulatory failure, and that's where we often automatically go when we think of regulatory failure. And I think, that's certainly something that we have to bear in mind. We could talk a bit more about, what maybe sits behind that contagion of legitimacy for the regulator in that space. But I think, you have to think that even in that space, what's regulatory failure one day is not regulatory failure another. These things are highly contextually dependent, and often even that political declaration of loss of legitimacy and regulatory failure will be informed by a whole host of surrounding contextual factors over which the regulator actually has no control whatsoever. There is a point here, I think, about how does the regulator defensively position for the possibility you're going to be on the receiving end of a political inquiry that perhaps potentially seeks to find a loss of legitimacy, included, stoked by media investigation. There's nothing illegitimate about that. That's part of operating as a regulator. When one of those things that isn't going quite right for you as a regulator catalyzes or into something which is much larger in this political space.
And it goes to the practical call on the definition. There's one coming back to George. If I can put it this way, does size matter? I mean, does it have to be big to be a regulatory failure in terms of its scale, or can there be, still important but mini kind of incidents? How does that shape in?
Well, could I just make one brief comment? Maybe Deb would. I think of the Waka Kotahi, regulatory failure, which I think is an example of this kind of loss of political legitimacy. In that case, a terrible incident where an individual died, labelled as regulatory failure. The reality of it, of course, is the road toll runs to hundreds and hundreds every year, but we don't classify that as regulatory failure. So what is it that makes the death of an individual in Dargaville an act of or political regulatory failure in the politically declared sense, loss of legitimacy in relation to the agency, and yet we have hundreds being killed every year as part of how we accept the death toll on the road. So these are, just maybe put that forward as something to consider.
Deb, what do you say to that with what you said earlier?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it doesn't make sense necessarily. And I think that there are a lot of competing forces and background things that take place to have a regulatory failure du jour, if you like. And, when I think about the Waka Kotahi regulatory failure, I think that it appeared to be a problem with us. No, the Waka Kotahi, I was at Waka Kotahi at the time, where the problem was people on the front line not doing their jobs properly. And it really wasn't that. It was much more complicated than that. But the forces of the day would characterise it as, they just needed to be better regulators, and we need to kind of make sure that doesn't happen again by doing A, B, and C. So what I also think is interesting and troubling is that over time things have changed, and we're much more likely as regulators to appear somewhere public on a front page, and I try not to hope that I'm not on the front page and someone else is, because that's not very kind to my colleagues.
You just get the webinars, Deb.
What I do find is that also influences the way that we behave as regulators. Yeah. So rather than doing the right thing, we might be persuaded to do the thing that will avoid us being on the front page. And I think that's dangerous territory for us to be in. And I'm also sure that we wouldn't consciously do that. But the threat of being on the front page, whether it's because we've carried out a review, which was in our interests to find out where our weaknesses were, and suddenly that review is publicised and, we're characterised as being not very good, that kind of thing can dissuade us from doing the very things that would benefit us in the long run.
And it's an interesting one, Jeroen, to you, and particularly when you've looked at some of the international case studies, the chilling effect of portrayal after the event. It could get picked up by the press, could get picked up by leading international academics like you, when you're studying it after the event. To what extent is there a reticence in regulators to have that sort of regulatory humility that I think you were pointing to a little earlier?
Yeah, fantastic question again. Oh my gosh. Look, I think sort of looking at, the example, of course, that we've been talking about so far here in New Zealand, but also internationally, I think what tends to happen after a regulatory failure is that regulators become very introspective and might even close down a little bit, sort of try to understand what has been going on. And that might be partly because the way the failure is being portrayed in the media is quite aggressive. So the rhetorical part of the failure takes over from the objective part of the failure. And then there is only this one incident, this one problem that is being taken by the media as the problem. Or how could the regulator have been so stupid to introduce private sector inspectors for our road safety? You know, that's sort of what would be sort of roughly the headline. Whereas the real problem is much more complicated. It's much more nuanced. So what the regulator tends to do is look internally and ask the question, what went wrong? What are all the things that went wrong? So we all know the image of the slices of Swiss cheese, you know, with all the holes in it. And only if the holes line up well, you get to a regulatory failure. So the regulator might want to understand that the media, the rhetorical issue is not interested in it. So going back sort of to the international review is that we realize that a regulatory failure is pretty much always a combination of small events that accumulate and eventually turn into that regulatory failure. So that's why I'm saying there are no easy stories about regulatory failure. But the problem is that as a regulator, you have to respond to something that the media actually presents as an easy story. So the media tells you, how could you have been so stupid to do X? Whereas you want to say, no, it wasn't just X, it was X, Y, Z, and the rest of the alphabet.
Yeah.
Dealing with that is very challenging.
And I think that's an interesting place just to pause, because we're now at half time and over 200 of you are with us and in front of us, and a number of that 200 are asking and or voting on some really thought out questions. So members of the audience, thank you very much for that. You're watching the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, and we're talking about regulatory failure. And pretty early on in the piece, all of us have discussed the need to define and describe and why it's important as a practical matter. And I think we've struck that. Before I turn just to some of the questions that members of the audience have got for us, and thank you again for that, just one thing from me, perhaps just to sort of sweeten the pill, if I can put it that way, because we also talk of regulatory stewardship as at least an antidote or a mitigant of regulatory failure. And I guess, first of all, to what extent is that proposition right? And also the second limb of that question, and I was in front of a number of colleagues yesterday talking about regulatory stewardship, how accessible is and should regulatory stewardship be for absolutely everyone? It's not just for the CEs, is it? So I don't know, George, perhaps you'd like to open on regulatory stewardship and its merits.
Well, I mean, the idea of regulatory stewardship is that we first of all are stewards. We have duties to look after something or care for something. It suggests something that's going to go on for a long period of time. Suggests something that does need to be maintained and cared for. I think, you know, it's an important part of what it means to be a decent public servant, actually. I mean, it comes back to the characterization of regulation as a core part of our social infrastructure and our social institutions, and the need to, I think, do two things. So first of all, understand clearly what role those institutions are intended to play in a public value proposition, but then be committed to making sure that they're able to perform that role and continue to do so over time. So I think, you know, part of this conversation is probably focused on the role piece. You know, what is it that regulatory systems need to do, and what is it if they don't do? The public level the allegation of failure at them for not doing it. So I think that's possibly what we're trying to get our heads around here.
Yeah, and it's a system-wide thing. We're all connected in the ecosystem as well. I mean, you know, you'd almost want to rebrand us as Tree Reg rather than G-Reg. You know, it's that hardwired. They're working across, having that visibility across a whole estate is a practical matter. Do you say that would, in a way that George has, I think, touched upon it, look to mitigate potential regulatory failures? And again, the second limb of that question is, this ain't just for the CEs to look at, is it? It's for everybody.
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree with George, and understanding the system and where the vulnerabilities are is a really important aspect of avoiding regulatory failure. No, it's not just for the CE, although the CE and her team do have a really important part to play. And that will include setting the tone for the type of regulator that you want to be, investing in capability and systems development, and creating the right leadership and culture. And these things have been talked about in the Productivity Commission report and in reviews on regulatory failures, the importance of those aspects. But the CE won't be able to do this alone, and we all have a responsibility right throughout the organisation. And I don't mean just the practitioners' part, across the organisation, to be really clear about the value of the regulatory system that we are looking after, and we need to tend to it really carefully. And I think that includes things like assurance exercises, where we might take a whole of system or a slice of system look at part of our regulatory system, test whether it's working as we expect it to. And then the challenging thing is inevitably we might find some things that we want to improve, and we're often just resourced for core activities only, and they don't necessarily feature. So what do we do about the things that we find wrong if we're active in the space of regulatory stewardship?
And it's interesting, Deb, because I mean, moving away from trees to rocks, you were making a point earlier, Michael picks this up, about the importance of a regulatory workforce empowered to look under rocks and consider what's there. Resonates for him, resonates for at least 10 other people who voted on the question. And it goes to resourcing, as I think you imply, having enough resourcing. Assuming that you've got the resource and assuming you can go ahead, you've then got the issues that George and Jeroen point to in terms of the other estates, as it were, the media, the de facto estates that sit outside government. And perhaps, George, I'll come back to you on this one. Assuming you've got money to deal with it, what are the obstacles that come in play then, generally speaking?
Ian, can I just hold that question? I'll come back to that. I just want to pick up on a point that I think Deb made really powerfully, and it's something that comes through in Jeroen's piece as well. This idea of regulatory failures are somehow surprises. What we know from regulatory failures, people in the organisation knew of these things, and they weren't picked up. They were sort of surprised in retrospect by the response to them, but they're not issues out of the blue. Our people know that these things are not working properly in the way that we're carrying out our regulatory functions. So I think, we need to be, maybe Jeroen might come back to this point on the study. So I think it's a really powerful one for the people on the webinar who are practitioners in this space. Look, we know where the regulatory failures are, including the places that lead to potential political contagion and loss of legitimacy for the regulator, because our people live this stuff every day. When they're practicing regulation, they know what's working and what's not working. So I think there's something there for us in thinking about regulatory failures. How do we pick up the signals within our own organisations and with our own systems that are probably telling us that we have an issue, but we're just not tuned in to what it is. Maybe we don't recognise it. Anyway, so
Jeroen, do come back on that one, because I think George is saying the writing's on the wall. Comment, Jeroen. What do you say to that?
Yeah, look, I think it might be a little bit too black and white to say the writing is on the wall or the writing will always be on the wall, but indeed, because regulatory failure is often the build-up of a whole lot of small things, there will be many people in the organization who are aware of things not going well. And if you keep ignoring all these small things that are not going well, then eventually it might result indeed in that huge regulatory failure that we might want to prevent. So just to touch on one of the comments that was just coming in, I think it was from Hamish, should we sort of distinguish between moral panic, which is what the media tells us is regulatory failure, and sort of the objective analytical regulatory failure, and bringing that into the idea of stewardship thinking? Well, of course, you could argue that pretty much every regulatory agency should acknowledge, accept, embrace the idea that they will be subject to a regulatory failure at some point. It's a simple fact of life. If we're only going to distinguish between failure and success, then the chances of doing something wrong are much larger than the chances of doing something right. And we tend to forget that. And indeed, it's, you know, what George was just saying, it's a bit weird that sometimes we are surprised by regulatory failure. So one of the things that you could do as a good regulatory steward, and that could go from the CE all the way to the frontline worker, is to say, how about we go and take all those beautiful reports that have been written by independent committees over the last 10, 20 years on regulatory failures in New Zealand and elsewhere, and ask the question, not what is this report writing about the agency that experienced the failure, but actually where is the report talking about us? And that would be a fantastic conversation to have with people who are implementing the regulation. Where is this report talking about things that are actually going wrong with us as well, or might be going wrong with us as well? So you could use those old reports or older reports as legitimate starting points for internal regulatory conversations about failure. And I would strongly suggest to do that at least twice a year. Take an older report and go through it and be very honest to yourself. What are the pointers in this report that show us where things might be going wrong for us? Simply because, coming back to that earlier story, there are no easy narratives about regulatory failure. It's a buildup of small things. So you basically want to mitigate the small things before they begin to combine and become something big.
Yes, absolutely. It's not so much the writings on the wall, is it? It's the writings in the report, and you can read half of these reports on the GREG website. They're there, and they're at large, and they're in the public domain. George, you've got a bit of a mini fan club developing out of the chat rooms here. 100% agree with George's point. Says one of our audience, regulatory failure could be mitigated by listening to frontline staff or stakeholders in some cases. I second that. Is a supporting comment. I think it goes to the combined causation point that you and Jeroen in particular are pointing to. There are lots of causes in the sort of the grab bag of causes that can cause a failure. They can be little ones or big ones, or little ones and big ones. And I arc it back to the discussion we've just had about stewardship and getting everybody across the line as seeing themselves as part of the system. Again, George, from an engagement and listening to colleagues across the sector and having those nexuses out there, what's your thought on the value of regulatory stewardship in that context as a potential antidote to regulatory failure?
Yeah, look, I think having your ears out and having good information flows from your own people, but also from your environment is really helpful. Well, it's not helpful. It's absolutely essential to properly reading the context in which you are regulating. And regulation is a highly contextual activity. Every day, regulators are navigating, you know, the unseen landscape. I kind of think of it a little bit like, you know, trying to sail a boat. You're out there on the water, which is a fluid medium. You're engaged with the atmosphere, which is a fluid medium, and you're trying to get yourself to a particular point on the horizon. And how you get there is, there are many routes to get there, but you have to be highly tuned to that environment, and you have to bring a bunch of skills to bear in navigating that space. But obviously being able to receive the signals for the context in which you operate is absolutely critical. I'll just say one maybe point, Jeroen, maybe you can help here, but my impression has been that the break points for all these regulatory failures have essentially been a perception that somehow the regulator has failed to hold parties to account for the obligations that are imposed by the regulation. Now, you can argue there's a bunch of reasons why you might get to that point, or that perception that somehow the regulator has not held parties to account. But I think it is maybe illustrative for us that the break point for sort of what might constitute a failure to regulate into a regulatory failure is sort of this sort of tipping point that comes, this sort of point with this idea that somehow the regulator is not holding the regulated environment to account. And it may be, you know, thinking about this, the root of this conversation around regulatory failure, maybe there's something in there that we need to be cognizant of as part of our regulatory activity. You know, as we're navigating towards that point through that environment, we have to understand that maybe that's something that is more important for us to focus on than other things, that maybe is a critical element of our work, and that maybe sometimes we forget that.
That's very interesting.
Do that at our peril. But I'll maybe put that maybe to our audience as well, who have thoughts about it.
Yes, absolutely, George. I was going to put it to Jeroen and Deb in the interim, but what you're really saying is that accountability is some kind of almost index.
Well, look, it's hard to say, but what you do notice with the regulatory failures, in my experience, is the break point is where suddenly there's a sense that the regulator is not holding the regulated parties to account. And, when you think about this kind of signals that you are getting back from your people, it's around, we know bad things are happening and we don't feel we're responding in the way that we should be to these bad things. We're not holding those who owe duties to account for that. And
yeah, audience, what do you think to that? Jeroen, what do you say to that proposition?
It's a good proposition. I think it probably depends on the regulated area or the regulated industry, of course. But specifically, if I think you might sort of think about it almost as how an avalanche builds up. Something very slow happens and sort of it slowly builds up speed. And if in an industry, one operator gets away with something and tells it to somebody else, it might sort of spread throughout the industry. So the industry might, over time, come to learn how they can get away with non-compliance or not being held to account for non-compliance. So there is that risk indeed that over time that builds up, and that could be, as George is saying, could be an indicator that regulatory failure is pretty much knocking at the front door, specifically because your inspectors know who is sort of, very often the inspectors know who is sort of not complying. So I do agree that accountability, holding your parties to account, and knowing that they are accountable for their conduct is an important part of seeing regulatory failure coming up. But I would not say it is the only one. So it's probably a necessary condition, but not sufficient. So it is not that we now suddenly have to focus on accountability only, because the rules need to be designed well. You need to be able to implement them. You need to be able to know if you can hold people to account. So it's a very critical part of preventing regulatory failure. Absolutely, George. That's for sure.
And I guess the public confidence, Deb, in the regulator, which I think is derivative on George's accountability point, and it also picks up on some of the points that are made in the chat, where you can and you can't, because there's not a political climate necessarily to address certain things openly. That is in the sort of, if you like, ecosystem of the extent to which the regulator can stand the accounts or withstand the account. But accountability is there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I've just noticed Gareth's comment in the chat about that it's not all about holding people to account. So people, those that are commentating on our regulatory failures are seldom as aware of the complexities of making a good regulatory regime, of getting the right results. So if we became a regulator that all it did was hold people to account, then we would pretty quickly lose our authorising environment, and we would be criticised quite severely, and it wouldn't necessarily get the results we were looking for either. So what we're dealing with is an external environment that when something goes wrong, the instant and easy answer is one, the regulator didn't hold someone to account, and that's to do with the frontline people, but it's way more complicated than that. More art than science, and that's what's actually really exciting about the work that we do. I think the other thing I would say is I completely agree with the comments that have been said before about listening to the front line and listening to people throughout the organisation and your sector. To Jeroen's point, if we're creating an uneven playing field for the sector, we've got a problem as a regulator. But I can't underestimate the idea, the notion of having really good leadership and culture within the regulator and being absolutely clear on what you're there to do. And we have had a lot of debates as regulators about the customer philosophy, and this is not the place for that discussion today, I'm sure.
Unless we've got Keith here, yes.
one of the things that the Waka Kotahi review found was that there was, I don't know if it said it in exactly these words, but my impression is that there was a kind of a blindness created by the culture, which was characterized as very customer focused. And in hindsight, it's easy to see how that could be problematic. Whilst in the organisation and working as a regulator, you're part of the culture. So, you know, how do we kind of make sure our settings are right? And I think probably most of us know or have thought about the regulatory pendulum, if you like, where we, you know, the flavour of the day for a modern regulator is either on the soft side or the hard side. But in reality, we've got to consciously choose, given the context for the day, where we need to make the right approach to get the right outcome.
And we've got quite an interesting few points that I think pick up off that, and from the lead questions here from Jason and Jude respectively. Jason, with lots of votes, says, is it common for regulators, especially at senior level, to see small regulatory failures as a threat, I guess almost a personal, professional threat, rather than an opportunity, and not actually leverage them to avoid the big ones? And with the flip side, in terms of interest there, when a regulator's consulting, says Jude, is often inundated with self-interested submissions from the regulated parties. But what about the less noisy ones? What can regulators do to get out there and better engage with consumers and other non-regulated parties, or ones that are, I guess, least resourced? It's all about self-interest all over the place based on these questions. I think, turning back to Jeroen, because the 38 articles you read, at least one of them touched upon, if you like, blindness by self-interest of the regulator, and the inability or unwillingness to see small regulatory failures for what they are, rather than as a professional threat. I wonder, perhaps you could go back to that.
Yes, thank you for that, Ian. Yes, so if you sort of to not spend too much time on the details of the review, and because people can read it later on, but what you sort of see happening is that sometimes indeed regulators don't feel comfortable, and that has been in the discussion as well, I can see, don't feel comfortable admitting that something might not be going so well in their regulatory system. And it could be that we have set up a culture of too much, a sense of feeling a personal responsibility for how the system is operating. So that could be sort of one of the problems. So it could be one of the problems that the senior leadership might feel too personally responsible if they would have to admit to a regulatory failure. So that could be a problem. On the other hand, what might happen as well, and this is something that you see in the broader literature also, is that it is very easy sometimes to actually shift that responsibility if there are a lot of regulators involved in a regulatory problem, or a lot of regulatory parties involved in a regulatory problem, to sort of say like, oh yeah, we knew there was something going on, but actually we thought it was the responsibility of those people at the front lines to sort it. And the people at the front line might say like, oh yeah, well, we knew it was happening, but we actually thought that our clients or customers would know better than to go to those dodgy warrant of fitness inspectors. And the warrant of fitness inspectors might say, oh yeah, look, we know there was something going on, but if the regulator is never coming to us, why would we change our practice? So people sort of keep moving the responsibility around. And that is probably a very human thing to do. You know, we find it hard to take responsibility here. So coming back to Deb's point, it's critical to have a good leadership team that is taking this up. But also coming back to the regulatory stewardship part, is set up a process that guides us through taking responsibility, maybe making sure that the responsibility doesn't become too personal, so that it is not being scary to take that responsibility. And sometimes, taking responsibility is not taking ownership. So taking responsibility for solving the failure is not saying I was at fault. It is just saying I acknowledge something has gone wrong, and we take the responsibility and the willingness to solve it. And that, sort of going back to George's point, helps you to restore your public accountability, your social license, and overall your legitimacy as a regulator. And that would be something that I think we would really need to see in the development of regulatory stewardship. Sort of that's thinking about failure, not only thinking about do our systems work well, but also thinking about how are we dealing with failure when it has occurred? How are we taking responsibility? How are we communicating about it? And so on and so forth.
I'm seeing lots of thumbs, Jeroen. Thank you for that. I'm floating in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen in answer to that. And I think it does actually deal with a lot of the questions that have sort of come up, and thanks members of the audience for those questions about what can we do to pick up John's question, to pick up regulatory failure. Do people forecast and forestall and foresee? I think your answer to that has just been yes, but then they give it the body swerve, if I can put it that crudely, because it's somebody else's problem, and everybody doing that as a causative matter means that it doesn't avert the failure. And so it's almost that regulatory humility that you started the conversation with, Jeroen, that perhaps helps. Just looking in the final few minutes at some of the other questions, because you've been extremely proactive, members of the audience, thank you for these, and one from Murray here. We can't allow for every eventuality or unexpected outcome. We need to be able to pivot quickly and allow for iterative change. And also, and this I think is quite a utilitarian question, be aware of a collision of sometimes competing regulatory environments like privacy and safety, efficacy and productivity. I guess there's a trade-off that happens everywhere. Even if we do foresee, a call needs to be made, do we run with it anyway, given our other policy settings? And that's one of the other questions. Is it accountability, or is that really more just the policy setting that it happens to be? How do you deal with the trade-offs, George, that I've just described? And what do you say about accountability being just, if I can put it that way, a symptom of a policy setting?
Well, on your latter point, accountability is a symptom of a policy setting. The policy settings obviously provide the platform for regulators to affect accountability. You know, I think, coming back to Deb's point, the subtext of the customer thing, I think from my perspective, regulators must always understand they deliver obligations, which have a different dynamic to them around delivering services. You know, you could argue the currency of services is delight. The currency of obligations, I would argue, is accountability. And so understanding what it is you're there to do as a regulator fundamentally is sort of sits at the heart of this. And I even where policy settings are suboptimal, no regulator worth their salt, is stymied by suboptimal policy settings. Otherwise, you'd never leave the office. The policy settings are never perfect. This is part of the context we navigate. The weather isn't always favourable, but nonetheless, we generally understand what the job is and how to affect it. And sometimes it's a case of attempting to affect it. You can actually highlight where the shortcomings in the policy settings are and stimulate the policy environment to remedy those. And I would argue that's actually an important part of regulatory stewardship, as well as highlighting where some of those deficiencies are. But I would argue that all that comes through this lens of obligation. That's the job of the regulator. That's the territory that the regulator occupies and is expected to steward.
And I think that also picks up on, and this is a cross-sell from me, the relationship, which is part of the stewardship frame between policy and regulatory, if we can use those terms to express a distinction. It also comes in one of the GREG films on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and YouTube search Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, conversations between policy and regulatory practitioners, that dialogue accessible at all levels. It's not just the CEs that makes the world go round. And members of the audience, we're just about to hit the top of the hour. So that is where we will leave it, with our thanks to all our panelists, to Deb, to Jeroen, to George. That's been terrific. And thank you, members of the audience. I close as I began with an MB karakia, and I do so now. Kia hike te tapu, kia watiai te ara, kia tarukiai te o marama, huiei taikiei. Members of the audience, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay well. And before I say ka kite ana, do please have a look at the GREG website where you can get our newsletter and find out about the next episode, where we'll be talking about conversations about COVID on the 23rd of June, because of course 24th of June is Matariki holiday. So stay safe, stay well. Until next time, from all of us here, ka kite anō.